I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to James Turk. He's the author of a new book, The Money Bubble, What to Do Before It Pops. James, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thanks, Max. It's always a big pleasure to be with you.
All right, let's talk about the money bubble. Talk a little bit about it. What is it about?
Yeah, you know, in 2004, John Rubino and I wrote The Coming Collapse of the Dollar, and we had two basic themes in that book. One was that housing was in a bubble and it was going to collapse, and secondly, he wanted to buy gold because it was undervalued and going to go much higher. What happened in 2008 we thought was going to bring the ultimate collapse of the dollar, but it didn't. It's been postponed by this unprecedented amount of money printing by central banks around the world. So earlier this year, as gold started to slide, you know, John and I started thinking, well, maybe we should write a follow-up, explain why gold is still good value, why it's going to go much higher, and the bigger issue, that what's created as a result of the 2008 collapse and government response to it, which is the money bubble. You know, fiat currency is going to be, that is the bubble, and that's what's going to pop.
You know, we talk about the outcome that many expected after the 2008 crash. One was massive money printing, which we got. Inflation, which we didn't get in the way we thought we would get it. We got it in asset price inflation, and we got it in some price inflation, the CPI, et cetera, but not to the point where the mainstream media was reporting like they would back in the 1970s. Oh my God, there's an inflation ramping up. There's no wage inflation. Wages have been stagnant. So it seems to me, and we're finding out more about this, that the inflation, one of the key inflation metrics that we've seen that people haven't talked about, and I think it plays into this money bubble idea, is the inflation in manipulation and fraud and index manipulation. So many of these indexes are being manipulated, we're finding out, whether it's energy index, LIBOR, Forex, the gold market. So the problems are there, but they're masked to some degree. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And this is one of the things we cover in the book, that a lot of false reporting that is being done by governments. You know, the Consumer Price Index doesn't really truly report anymore the cost of living. John Williams of shadowstats.com does an alternative inflation calculation using the same one the government did back in 1980 without all of the modifications that they've made in subsequent years to make inflation look less than it really is. And today inflation is running about 9%. But you know, you can see it in other ways, Max. And you know, inflation takes a while for it to build, and right now it's been building in terms of, you know, people who are rich. Look what's happening to collectibles. Look what's happening to real estate in places like here in London. These are just going through the roof. You know, smart people understand that, you know, holding dollars in a bank account doesn't make sense anymore. Holding euros in a bank account doesn't make sense anymore. You want to acquire tangible assets of all sorts because we're in a money bubble, but these fiat currencies are going to pop.
Right, so the money bubble, we see it already in terms of London real estate prices, the art market is trading extraordinarily high, collectibles, various collectibles. We don't see it in gold, and it's turned out that gold, that manipulation in gold is such where the price is, as a price signal, it would take something away from the masking of what's really going on, so it's very carefully managed by the central planners and the central bankers.
Exactly, but it can only go on to the extent that central banks are willing to empty their vaults completely. And when those vaults are completely emptied, then the price is going to go much higher.
Let's talk a little bit about that emptying of the vaults. In other words, from what I understand, the gold the banks, the bullion banks who have a relationship with the central banks of the world, they are allowing folks to sell futures contracts essentially naked. And then they make good on those contracts at some point by taking money out of the vaults of the central banks. And this gold is going east. It's going to China. It's going to Bangkok. And so talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the gold is flowing from west to east, and this has been a trend that's been underway for several years, but it's really accelerated over the past 12 months. And it's flowing from west to east because in the west we generally don't understand gold's utility, whereas in the east they understand, you know, gold's usefulness. The Chinese character for gold and money are in fact the same thing. So they intuitively understand gold's utility and its usefulness as money. And as long as wealth is being created in that part of the world, which it is, gold is going to flow from west to east. And unfortunately, it's a replay of what happened in the 1960s with the cartel called the London Gold Pool, tried to keep gold at $35 an ounce. Eventually, there was 10,000 tons of gold dishoarded from Fort Knox during the 1960s to try to maintain this price, but ultimately the market knew that gold was worth more than $35 an ounce. today, the circumstances are slightly different because it's harder to actually see the gold coming out of central bank vaults because, again, the false reporting that we're seeing and the misleading accounting. But we can see it in terms of the flows. So, you know, the gold is going out of the vaults, and eventually we're going to see a ratcheting up of the gold price, just like happened after the London gold pool collapsed in 1968.
I want to talk about Paul Krugman for a second, who's over there at the New York Times. And you can't have a big kind of state-sponsored manipulation without a propagandist. And Paul Krugman, who's their ostensibly economics writer, although he doesn't seem to know much about economics, has made a couple of remarkable statements recently. One is that the U.S. dollar is backed by guns. There's no intrinsic value. That we understand. But if you don't take it, we're going to shoot you. Essentially, that's the statement. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, you know, that's not the way markets work. You know, markets work on voluntary cooperation between individuals. And it's markets that chose gold and silver as money in the first place. What governments have done is they've used guns to supplant the free flowing of gold and silver as currency and money throughout the world. But what they've created is this authoritarian environment in which governments and individuals, the power balance is no longer balanced the way it should be, which is why you see these various uprisings or disruptions in different parts of the world, most recently in Italy with the pitchfork movement that's going on down there. So we're heading off in the wrong direction. And
right, so authoritarianism is, in the U.S., you don't expect it. But clearly, if the New York Times is calling for authoritarianism and saying, take our money or we'll kill you, that's not a free market. That's not a condition of supply and demand. That's not what you'd expect to read in the pages of Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. I mean, this is an empire that's collapsing, that's relying on manipulation of propaganda. Now, I want to touch on something we talked about in London a couple of years ago. I brought to your attention, and at that time you were very curious about it, but now it seems as though you've gone full-fledged, you know, supporter. And this is very interesting because of the gold crowd seems split. Some are for it, some are not. Talk about it. Of course, I'm talking about Bitcoin. Paul Krugman recently came out and said Bitcoin is evil. So if he hates it, we know that's probably a good thing.
Yeah, and
James Turk.
I saw the Financial Times said that Bitcoin's going to be under $50 sometime in the near future, which obviously is, in my view, is not going to happen. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I was a little bit skeptical about Bitcoin in the beginning, but I'm actually a believer in it now, and I do own some Bitcoin. And the reason why I own it is I think it's a technological advancement, and it accomplishes what we tried to do to a certain extent with gold. The difference, of course, is that gold is something that governments want to control and regulate, whereas Bitcoin is beyond government regulation, and that's really one of its beauties. And I think that's one of the reasons why an authoritarian like Krugman, you know, a lover of government, hates Bitcoin.
So the fact that you can't regulate it is one of its attributes.
Except it is regulated. It's not regulated by government. It's regulated by the market. It's regulated by everybody who studied it and analyzed it and sees that, yes, this thing has utility and it has usefulness. That's the best form of regulation. I mean, government regulation fails all of the time. Look at 2008. Every one of those institutions that failed was heavily regulated. What did it accomplish? It didn't accomplish, that regulation didn't accomplish anything. But when you're regulated by the market and people can pick and choose what's good and what's not good, that's the best form of regulation. That's what Schumpeter called the creative destruction of capitalism. You know, the best survive because they make a profit and they stay in business. They don't get government subsidies or government handouts to continue them operating.
Is it money? That's the question, because we know from Aristotle's definition, money has four basic attributes. It's portable, it's fungible, it's desirable, and there's an intrinsic value case for gold.
Yes.
That's the one area that people are tripped up on. Do you see an intrinsic value, or what is your intrinsic value for Bitcoin, if you can speak on that?
Well, I like to distinguish between money on the one hand and currency on the other. You know, money is this mental tool that we use for economic calculation, and you know, but we then use a form of currency that represents the actual money. Money is a tangible asset, though, in the sense that we humans advance because goods and services pay for goods and services. If, for example, you're a shopkeeper and I say, I'm going to pay for this loaf of bread next week, that transaction has not been completed. You've accepted credit. If I pay for that with fiat currency, you've accepted credit. You've got a risk a payment risk until you actually take that fiat currency or convert that promise into some good or service, because it's goods and services that enable us to raise our standards of living. It's not financial assets. It's not promises. They're forms of financial wealth as opposed to forms of tangible wealth. And it's ultimately tangible wealth which creates higher standards of living.
This is an excellent point. You're saying if you give me a pound for goods and service, that pound really has no value until I convert it back into a goods and service.
Exactly.
So people who say Bitcoin, well, you know, it has no value because conversion, there's a risk of owning it or holding it. Well, that's paper money has a similar risk. It has no value until you put it into something.
Exactly right. But the thing is that Bitcoin has this value because of its utility as a form of currency. And that is the unique attribute that it brings to the table. And I think Bitcoin is going to have a profound influence on global economics, global trade, you know, the global economy as we move forward from here. When I talk about Bitcoin, I should say that I mean cryptocurrencies, because you know, if you remember, you know, back in 1979, I bought my first spreadsheet. It was called VisiCalc. It was replaced by 123. It was replaced by Microsoft Excel. There may be other cryptocurrencies that come along the road at a future date that might be better than Bitcoin. But the concept of cryptocurrencies itself is really the technological innovation, and Bitcoin is the prominent one at the moment as being the first mover.
Can you say that the way that gold is a precious metal, that in case of Bitcoin, you could consider it a precious number? Because the mining that goes on, you know, you're finding these numbers that are only possible through the array of hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of computers. They exist in cyberspace somewhere, but they have to be mined. They are precious numbers. So can you say that this represents precious numbers the way that gold is a precious metal?
Yes, I think that's a very good way of comparing the two. There is one slight difference. Bitcoin is tangible in the sense that there is a computer code and everything backing it, but it's not corporeal like gold. You can't put it in your hand. But you can actually take a Bitcoin and put it on a piece of paper and use that as a form of currency as well. You know,
it's corporeal?
Yeah, it is corporeal. and yeah, in
so
that
that's
sense.
Another argument flushed.
One thing to add is that, you know, we've been studying Bitcoin for the past year at Gold Money, and we've recently opened a small subsidiary in the UK called Netagio, Netagio. And what we're doing initially is offering storage for Bitcoin, but ultimately we're going to move further and further into the Bitcoin economy.
All right, well, that's all the time we have. James Turk, thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Thanks, Max.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I want to thank my guest, James Turk of Gold Money, but he's got this new book out, The Money Bubble. It's on Amazon as an ebook on a Kindle, and then it'll be corporeal, and you can hold it while you're mining for Bitcoin. Until next time, bye, y'all.